The Economic Club of Minnesota's mission is to provide a world-class, nonpartisan forum for national and international leaders in business and public policy to discuss ideas that affect how Minnesota can better compete in the global economy. The Economic Club of Minnesota, engaging the world, strengthening Minnesota.
So it really is different being in Minnesota. I don't know if you noticed this over there, but there's a seminar on lame sows. It's called Feet First, lame sows. And someone I was walking in with pointed out, well, that's kind of, there's actually a connection there. We got a lot of pork in Washington, and there are a lot of words that people use to describe Washington, but lame is definitely one of them. So I don't think it's an accident that the voices were going to be pumped in here together. So you're going to get the quick version. I'm glad the book's available. You can get the full version. This is how I came to write a book about the federal budget, which is not exactly like writing a book about shades of gray. I wrote a book on the Fed. The people at Random House said to me, the Fed was boring. You made the Fed interesting. The budget's boring. Why don't you write a book about the budget and make it interesting? And I said, well, it wasn't that hard to make a book about the Fed interesting when Ben Bernanke was staring into an abyss the size of the Great Depression. But it's kind of hard to write a book about nothing happening. I mean, a book-length treatment of the failure of the super committee is not something I want to read, let alone write. And I said, okay, so what if you did a narrative about how the federal budget works? And they described this situation where the president sits down with his advisors and they weigh priorities, and then the president submits a budget to Congress, and then Congress rationally debates the priorities, and at the end of the process, they make choices and the money. And I'm saying to myself, these are the people who edit business books for Crown at Random House, so they're probably above the median voter, and they think this is how the budget works. So at that point, I said, well, maybe I do have something to contribute here. Someone asked me the other day how long I'd been working on the book, and I said, well, 25 years, because that's how long I've been covering budget issues in Washington. And I went through the budget with them using the charts that Pete Peterson has made for his foundation. Pete Peterson is a billionaire who's spending literally $1 billion of his dollars to run a campaign to raise awareness of the federal deficit. I'm not sure he's moved the needle a lot, but he's produced some great graphs. And as I went through the graphs that Peterson made, and they're excellent, they're on their website, the Peterson Foundation, I realized that one of the reasons why so many people are confused about the deficit is we've made it impossible to understand. So I set out to write a book for people who kind of know that the deficit and the budget is important and a problem, and have never managed to get to the end of any Wall Street Journal story on that subject. So I know, and what I realized really from Peterson's charts is that it doesn't have to be that complicated, that you can break this thing into digestible morsels, and we need to make some choices. And what I'm concerned about is that too many people in my profession have made their choices and then proceed to assemble facts to justify their choices. So you go on MSNBC, and they start with some premise about the budget, and they give you 12 facts to support it. And you go to Fox, and they give you a different premise about the budget, and 12 different facts, and you'd never know they were talking about the same thing. So I do not have the David Wessel plan to reduce the federal budget. If you want that, Tim Penny has one, I'm sure. So what I think is important is that people have some grasp of the facts so that they can make choices or understand the choices that are being offered to them. And unfortunately, the candidates aren't making that easy. The candidates are specialized in two kinds of unproductive behavior. One is to accuse the other guy of being a bad guy. My favorite example is cutting Medicare. I mean, we are going to cut Medicare. Cutting in Washington means slowing the rate of growth from what it would otherwise be. Both Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan and Barack Obama say we have to cut Medicare. But neither of them are open about that. They just blame the other guy for doing it, which sort of makes you somewhere between despondent and crazy. And the other thing is that we've made it so complicated because a lot of the people who do budgets in Washington act as if it's something that mere mortals can't understand. There's entitlements and appropriations and authorizations and everything is so complicated you just want to go back to watching the football game on TV. And there's a reason it's complicated. It's a lot of money. The government spent $3.6 trillion last year. Now, one of my inspirations in writing about the economy is Dave Barry, who was the humor columnist for the Miami Herald. And he once observed that the reason people don't understand the deficit and the budget is because the words trillions, billions, and millions sound so much alike. He said that reporters like me ought to refer to golf balls, watermelons, and hot air balloons. And maybe people will get some idea of the orders of magnitude. And I think he has a point. Last year, the Office of Management and Budget sent out instructions to each of the agencies for how to submit requests for the president's budget. The memo explaining how the submissions were to be made was 972 pages. The president's budget itself, 4 volumes, is 2,238 pages. And then each agency submits an additional justification to Congress. The Department of Homeland Security submitted 3,134 pages to Congress, 1 page for every $12.6 million they wanted to spend. So it's big. That's it's inevitable. It's big. But my goal is, in the few minutes I have here, is to say, forget about this. Divide it into chunks, and you too can be a budget expert. All right, so some digestible morsels. 1, 63% of federal spending last year was on autopilot. It was money that had been committed before Congress arrived for the first day of work. It's the money that has been promised to people in Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and farm subsidies and veterans' pensions and the interest on the federal debt. And because it's on autopilot, when Congress is so inclined, they just ignore it. They talk about it and they don't do anything about it, and they spend the rest of the year arguing about how to allocate the other third of the budget, the annual appropriations that go to for everything from the Coast Guard to the National Park Service. I think that, and that fraction is growing. And that means that they never have to confront, unless they're in the mood, and as you've noticed, they haven't been in the mood lately, the really big fiscal spending issues. Second, you can't fix the budget problem, you can't fix the deficit without figuring out how to slow the growth of health care. That's one thing that actually Republicans and Democrats in Washington agree on. And as you know, they don't agree on much. They can't even agree when you talk about the fiscal cliff that's going to hit at the end of the year. Does that mean you run into the cliff, or does it mean you go over it? They can't even agree on metaphors. But if you talk to any of them, Paul Ryan, Rob Portman, Chris Van Hollen, Kent Conrad, they all say the same thing. You can't do this without doing something about health care costs. In 1960, before Lyndon Johnson signed Medicare and Medicaid into law, health care accounted for less than 10% of the federal spending. Today, 25%. 10 years from now, according to the Congressional Budget Office, 33%. It will literally crowd out everything else. We can't do anything about the federal deficit without doing something about spending. We can't do anything about spending without doing something about health care. Now, health care costs are going to go up for the simple reason that, A, more people are going to be on government programs because the baby boom is retiring. The number of people over age 65 will increase by 1/3 over the next decade. And even if we tinker with the retirement age, most of them are going to end up on Medicare. And the cost of health care is going up faster than the cost of everything else. So we're going to spend more on health care. The question is, how can we restrain that growth? And as you know, President Obama and Mitt Romney have different views about how to do that. Third, you can't talk about the federal budget without confronting the defense budget. 20% of federal spending last year, $700 billion, went to defense. That's more than the combined defense budgets of China, Britain, France, Russia, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Germany, India, Italy, Brazil, South Korea, Australia, Canada, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, Spain, and Israel. Our defense budget last year was bigger than the combined defense budgets of the next 17 defense budgets. Now, we all know we need a strong national defense to protect us from everything from missiles from Iran to cyber terrorists from China. But we have to decide how much are we willing to spend to basically be the world's security service. Now, I'm not an expert in defense, and I'm not going to give you a lecture on what's the strategic imperatives. But in the book, and for this conversation, I think you can appreciate the kind of decisions that have to be made and how many of them there are. Well, here's one. How many aircraft carriers is enough? Bob Gates, the former defense secretary, observed that we have 11 aircraft carriers. Congress has mandated the Navy have 11 aircraft carriers. No other country has one. And there's a big debate in the military about whether aircraft carriers are the way to win World War II if we fight that again, or whether we really need them now. But what struck me is how expensive these decisions are. The Navy wants to replace one aircraft carrier every 5 years for the rest of my life and then some. Each aircraft carrier costs $11 billion. An aircraft carrier, the Navy says, is 4.5 acres of mobile sovereign territory. $11 billion is a lot of money. $11 billion is the same sum that Medicare spent last year to replace hip, shoulder, and knee joints for 750,000 elderly people. One aircraft carrier, 750,000 joint transplants. And even more interesting, aircraft carriers are expensive even in death. The Navy says it'll cost $2 billion to decommission each aircraft carrier because they have nuclear reactors on them. So we have to decide how many is enough. And we can't give the military everything they want. As Bob Gates says, the military, he said he faced the same problem that Eisenhower did, that the military always wants more stuff. But deciding how much is too much and how much is enough is tough. I mean, interestingly, Bob Gates also worried, of all things, about healthcare costs. In 2010, he gave a speech at the Eisenhower Library on the anniversary of the victory in World War II, and he pointed out he worried about a lot of things that Eisenhower worried about, and he worried a lot about the things that Eisenhower never worried about. And one of them was healthcare costs. This is the Secretary of Defense. In the year he spoke, 2010, the military spent more money on healthcare than it did on the war in Iraq. And some of that is because there's a very generous health insurance program for people who are, quote, retired, that is, they've been 20 years in the service. More generous in the healthcare than any and the rest of us have. And presidents, Republican and Democrats, have tried to change that, but they always get shot down because the veterans lobby is very strong. We're not talking about care for soldiers or wounded warriors. We're talking about people who retire at age 45 from the military, get another job, turn down the insurance their employer offers because the taxpayers are offering them a better deal. So there are decisions to make in defense. There's also decisions to make in taxes. Some people think we can do this, reduce the deficit without raising taxes. I think that would be nice. I think it's pretty difficult to imagine the public accepting spending cuts tough enough that will allow us to do this without taxes. Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan say they can do that. We'll see what happens if they win, if they can really pull that off. But I think there's a lot of misinformation about taxes. And one interesting thing is that for people of the middle class, that 20% of the families who live in the middle of the income distribution, the share of their income that's going to federal taxes, not state and local, but federal, over the last 30 years has been falling. Before Ronald Reagan came to Washington, they spent 19% of their income in federal payroll, income, and other taxes. In 2007, before the Great Recession, it was down to 14%. And it's fallen further since because the recession, of course, has reduced their incomes and we've had some tax credits for them. But the point is that the government has been able to keep increasing spending without, although I don't think most people believe it, increasing the tax burden in the middle class. So how is that possible? Well, one way it's possible is we've increased the amount of money we get from people at the top because they have gotten a bigger share of the economic pie. But the other way we've gotten it is we borrow. Last year, 36 cents of every dollar the federal government spent was borrowed. 36 cents. Now, once upon a time, when I was in college, the professors used to say, well, it's not a problem because we owe it to ourselves. Well, that's no longer true. Half the federal debt is now held by foreigners, and a quarter of that is held by the Chinese. We have, in an extraordinary historical anomaly, a situation where a country like China, which has grown remarkably over the last couple decades, but still has a lot of poor people, save a lot of money or are forced to save a lot of money, They collect it all at the central government. They ship it over the Pacific so we can get cheap mortgages. It's been a great ride. And it would be great if it went on forever, but it's not going to go on forever. And I think the scary thing is that most people in Washington now say that we're in the post-denial phase of this conversation. Very few people use the line that Cheney's supposed to have used and say that deficits don't matter. But you wouldn't know that from the policies they're pursuing. And it seems to me somewhere between foolish and insane to have a government policy that boils down to this. A, this can't go on forever. B, we have policies that act as if it can go on forever. That just doesn't seem to me like a great strategy. Now, it is not true that today's deficit is the problem. Today's economic problem is really unemployment. That we got the jobs numbers today. It was another disappointing month. You know, we created fewer than 100,000 jobs. At this rate, it'll be better part of a decade before we're back at full employment. Unemployment is down to 8.1%. Ben Bernanke said that that's at least 2 percentage points, and I think he meant more than 2 percentage points, above what we could achieve. Well, 2 percentage points of unemployment is about 3 million people. So today's problem is unemployment. And we have been fortunate that we have been able to borrow, as a country, extraordinary amounts of money, as I said, much of it from overseas, at extraordinarily low interest rates. We are not yet like Spain and Italy. They have to pay 7% or more if they can borrow. The federal government is borrowing 10-year money at 1.6%. That's the lowest in my lifetime. So how can this be? Well, I think it's pretty clear. The Chinese have a lot of money. They look across the world. They say, look at us, and they say, we are really a dysfunctional society. And then they look at what their alternatives are. There's Japan, which has a debt load twice ours, given the size of their economy, and a shrinking population. And they look at Europe, and they can't even agree if they want to continue to have a currency. I mean, the one thing we have going for us is that, so far anyways, Texas hasn't decided to secede and start its own currency. I know there's some people, both in and out of Texas, who'd like that to happen. So they look at the world, and they say, where could we do better? Where would our money be safer? And they can't find any place. The United States is the world's tallest midget. But that is giving us, in my opinion, a sense of false complacency. It has allowed our political leadership to argue about this problem without doing anything about it. And so I think one question to ask yourself is, well, why should we do anything about this? I mean, after all, it's a pretty good gig. The rest of the world saves a lot of money. They lend it to us. We can have low interest rates. We don't want to raise taxes or cut spending now. Our economy is lousy. What's the problem? Well, one problem is if something can't go on forever, it won't. But here's just one way to think about it. Last year, even though interest rates are very low, the government spent $230 billion on interest. That was more than the combined budgets of the Departments of Commerce, Education, Energy, Homeland Security, Interior, Justice, State, plus the federal courts. More money on interest than we spent on all those things. And President Obama's budget says that if the economy does great in the next 5 years, and if Congress took every suggestion that the president makes in his budget, that is the Pollyanna scenario here, interest as a share of federal spending would be 12% of the federal budget, double what it is today. Because as interest rates go up, when the economy recovers, the interest tab will go up. It's like having an adjustable rate on your credit card bill and not making the minimum monthly payments. You know, it's not a good thing. And this will crowd out our ability to spend on other things, whatever the things are that you value and you think the society will do. So this can go on for a long time. It might end next week. It might end 5 years from now. I don't know. But as it goes on, the share of income that we have to send overseas as interest on the borrowing we've done will grow, and that's money we can't spend here at home. All right, so this doesn't seem like a great place to be, and there are not very many people in Congress who defend this. So why is it that we're having such a hard time doing something about this? There's probably a dozen reasons. There's two that I want to mention. One is and I'll just talk about this briefly, I'm happy to talk about it more in the question area, is the society really has become very polarized, and Congress is a reflection of that. The number of people like Tim Penny in Congress is somewhere between 0 and none. You look at these charts that the political scientists make of the votes of Republicans and Democrats. You might have two mountains. And once upon a time, there were some liberal Republicans from the Northeast, and there were some conservative Democrats, mostly from the South. And the two mountains kind of intersected, and there was this band of people in the middle who could be counted on to be the center if a president wanted to do something on the budget. Well, the mountains have moved apart. When George Bush did a deficit deal in the early 1990s, he did it because the Democrats in Congress voted for it. Newt Gingrich voted against it, but the Democrats voted for it. When Bill Clinton did his deficit reduction deal in the early 90s, there were no Republicans for it. And Barack Obama's major legislation, the stimulus or health care, they haven't gotten any, fewer Republican votes than you count in the fingers of one hand. So that Congress is polarized, and it's partly because the populace is polarized. Every poll shows that in many ways the country is evenly divided and people are moving farther apart, and the media has contributed to that. We live in a society, we live at a time when you can get your prejudices confirmed by typing in the right URL. So you believe one set of things, you can believe that Obama wasn't born in the US, you can find some website to say that. If you believe that Mitt Romney never left Bain Capital, he's still secretly running Bain Capital, you can find a website to tell you that. And so for people like me who are trying to say, like, we're trying to call it as we see it, it's a scary time. So there's then that polarization of the society. But I think there's also a fundamental underlying problem. And for this, I want to introduce one of the few heroes in a book. When you write a book about the deficit, there are not a lot of heroes. The Fed book was easy. I made Ben Bernanke a hero, with a little help from Gary Stern. But in this book, one of the heroes is Doug Elmendorf, who's the director of the Congressional Budget Office, one of the few institutions in Washington that actually works the way it was designed to work, because both Republicans and Democrats of Congress recognize that their power depends on having accurate information. So Republicans and Democrats on the budget committees have defended the integrity of CBO. Elmendorf is a wonderful guy, he could play a nerdy economics professor in a movie. He's built like that. And the New York Times once said that he is thoughtful about almost everything, which is true. He told me that when he was asking the woman out for a first date who became his wife, he wanted to know, where should I take her for the first date? And he decided to go to a baseball game, a Boston Red Sox game, because he figured it was the optimal mix of action on the field, so you don't need to talk, but not sometimes of pause so you did have a conversation. So I thought, like, this is how economists plan their dates, the optimal mix, right? So I mentioned this in the book, and as soon as the book came out, I got an email from somebody who said, oh yeah, he's a smart guy. What would he have done if there was a rain delay? But Elmendorf has the best single sentence I've ever heard on why this deficit is so hard to fix. He says, the country faces a fundamental disconnect between the services people expect the government to provide, particularly in the form of benefits for older Americans, and the tax revenues they're willing to send to the government. People who think we can reduce the deficit without affecting them are living in a fantasy. There's just not enough other people to tax. There are not enough other people whose benefits to be cut to solve this problem. But most people kind of think it can be solved on someone else's back. And frankly, the candidates are pandering to that view. My dream is that one of these this is going to happen, don't worry about it, that one of these presidential campaign debates will begin with a big chart. And the candidates will have agreed in advance, this is a deficit trajectory, and this is where we want it to be. And the moderator will say, as I did at the beginning of this talk, look, there are a lot of details, but you really only need to make a few big decisions. And each candidate would have to say, this is what I do on taxes, and none of this, I'll lower rates and get rid of loopholes, but I can't tell you which loopholes I'm going to get rid of until after I get elected. Or this, President Obama's equivalent, which is to say, I'm going to only raise taxes on the top 2%, and everybody else is going to get off scot-free. People have to say, what are you going to do about defense? What are you going to do about taxes? What are you going to do to slow the growth of healthcare spending? What are you going to do about other benefits? And what are the other things that government does that you want to get rid of? And don't tell us you're going to solve this problem by closing the Department of Education. if the federal government fired every single employee, every single one, from the president to the person who works at the TSA at Humphrey Airport here, we would have saved $435 billion last year. That would have reduced the deficit by less than 1/3. Most of the money that the government takes in goes out again in benefits or grants to state and local governments or contracts. So we're not going to solve this problem unless we all agree or are forced to take some pain. So one thing that you can ask, and I'll close on this, is how do we move the ball? How do we get out of this thing? What forces action? And I have a theory on that, and the theory is it's either crisis, perhaps a financial market crisis, perhaps something like the fiscal cliff at the end of the year, or an outbreak of leadership. And I'm not sure which is the more likely. So I'm kind of proud of this theory, this sentence. I like it when people laugh when I say the outbreak of leadership line. So I went to see Leon Panetta, who's now the defense secretary, but was, of course, head of the House Budget Committee when the Democrats did a deal with George Bush. I went to see him in his office in the Pentagon, which is roughly the size of this room. And somewhere over there where the camera is, there's a little shrine to the killing of Osama bin Laden. So I tried out this theory on him, and this is what he said. He said, I used to tell the students I had in the years I was out of Washington that we're either governed by leadership or crisis. And I thought, oh, this is great. You know, this is the quote I need to say that I'm right. And he goes on, he laughs. Leon Panetta is one of these people who laughs at all his own jokes, even before he tells them. He laughs and says, and I always thought that if leadership wasn't there, then ultimately you rely on crisis to drive decisions. In the last few years, my biggest concern is that crisis doesn't seem to drive decisions either. So there goes that theory. So that's where we are in Washington. We're waiting. We're waiting either for a crisis or an outbreak of leadership. I don't know what happens after the election. I doubt that we're going to have such a resounding victory by one side or the other that this thing will be resolved easily. You know, we've evolved this system, which is sort of a weird hybrid of not quite a parliamentary system, but not completely the old system we had, where the minority can stop anything the president wants to do, but can't make anything happen and can't force him to resign the way they can do in a system like the one they have in Europe, where you have a prime minister. And so they fought themselves to a stalemate. Now, I don't want you to go out all and short the dollar and kill yourself afterwards. So there is a chance that after the election that the president, whether it's Romney or Obama, will sort of give the tough love speech to the American people. And he'll use Pete Peterson's charts, and he'll say, some of the things I said during the campaign, you know, I've looked at the books and I can't keep all my promises. We're going to have to cut some benefits, and we're going to have to, in my opinion, probably raise some taxes. But I promise you that we're going to do this in a way that spreads the pain. It's going to be fair. Then he's going to pause, and he's going to say, you have to trust me. Well, there's the problem. The American people's trust in the government is at record lows. We in the newspaper industry love to look at these polls of Congress's popularity rating because Congress is one of the few places that comes lower on the list than the media, right? But that is a fundamental problem. We cannot fix this problem unless people accept that we're all going to have to tighten our belts a little bit, and we can't fix this problem unless people have some faith in the people they elect. You aren't powerless. We live in a democracy. You vote for them. If you think this problem has to be fixed, well, think about that when you vote. Thank you very much.
The Economic Club of Minnesota's mission is to provide a world-class, nonpartisan forum for national and international leaders in business and public policy to discuss ideas that affect how Minnesota can better compete in the global economy. The Economic Club of Minnesota, engaging the world, strengthening Minnesota.